Hi. This is Lord HardThrasher here. You are actually watching right now part 2 of a 2-part video. Do not panic. You can watch this on its own. It will make sense as a standalone video. However, there is a part 1 if you want it. There's a link back in the description and you can go back there. Alternately, you can wait a couple of weeks and I will give you the full supercut in one long hit.
And the generation to come, your children that shall rise up after you, and the foreigner that shall come from a far land shall say, when they see the plagues of that land, and the sickness wherewithin the Lord hath made it sick, and the whole land thereof is brimstone and salt and a burning, and it is not sown, nor beareth, nor any grass groweth therein, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. Even all the nations shall say, wherefore hath the Lord done this unto this land? What meaneth the heat of this great anger? On the 5th of March 1943, 362 bombers fell on Kiel, and Arthur "Bomber" Harris opened his offensive against the Ruhr Valley. Over the next 5 months, the might of RAF Bomber Command dropped nearly 40,000 tons of bombs on the industrial heartland of Germany in what Harris hoped would be the decisive blow against the Nazis. They were guided by Obo, led by the Pathfinders, and the bomb loads that they dumped on the homes and the factories below were carefully calculated, a culmination of 3 years of scientific effort. The attacks were relentless. Day after day, nuisance raids kept factory workers away from their lathes, and night after night, Harris's force drove the raw workers into their shelters. Every major city and node of production was hit repeatedly in a systematic attempt to destroy the economic cornerstone of the German economy. They went to Essen, to Aachen, to Duisburg, to Bochum, to Düsseldorf, to Dortmund, to Barmen-Württemberg, to Mulheim, to Eberfeld, to Glensinghausen, to Cologne, and of course, in the middle of all this, to the dams of the Mona and the Eder rivers. They destroyed tens of thousands of acres of built-up area, hundreds of thousands of homes were damaged or demolished, thousands of factories were destroyed, and thousands more dispersed across the Reich in response. For the first time, the RAF inflicted serious casualties on the German population, displacing perhaps 2 million people in the process. The war, which for many had been something which was abstract and far away, suddenly came home to Western Germany in the form of fire and fury from the night sky. The impact was immediate and devastating. German production across the economy was severely disrupted, with growth in almost all areas of economic output of the Reich either slowed or stopped altogether. Ammunition, subcomponents, aircraft production, engines, small arms, tanks, all the paraphernalia of war was impacted despite enormous efforts on the ground to do something to try and counter this and to recover the capacity as fast as possible. The economic output, which had been growing steadily across the German economy, flatlined and it never recovered its momentum. Steel production, for example, dropped by 200,000 tons almost overnight, halting production of U-boats and tanks in a way barely conceived possible before. From the Nazi High Command's perspective, the timing could not have been worse. Their armed forces were stretched well beyond the point at which they expected the Soviets to surrender, more than 2,000 kilometres from Berlin, and fighting for their very existence after the humiliations at Stalingrad in February. For all this fire and fury, though, Harris was relying on the Ministry of Economic Warfare, the MU, and the small RE8 assessment team to tell him what was going on in Germany. Whilst this impact was much greater than had ever happened before, the MU believed that Bomber Command was having a much greater impact than it actually was, and in different parts of the German economy from that it actually was affecting. They thought millions of man days were being permanently lost to German production, when in fact their own experiences after Coventry and the Blitz should have told them just how fast a city could recover from an attack. 80% capacity recovery would normally happen within about a month or so, and the failure to follow up raids and keep pressing the attack blunted its impact and quite possibly did actually stop the collapse of the Ruhr in 1943. And all of this happened to a backdrop of German attempts to prepare for something called Operation Citadel. This was the liquidation of the Kursk salient on the Eastern Front, necessitating a delay of over a month in launching the attack, a month well used by the Soviets to prepare their defences to a depth barely conceivable to the OKW. The Soviets moved more than 1.3 million troops into the area, with another 500,000 in reserve against an attacking force of just 770,000 men, and they did most of this in the final month. It would prove to be the last German offensive in the east, not least because the lack of tanks and guns and things that had never been built thanks to the so-called Battle of the Ruhr. This was Bomber Command in full-bore fuck-shit-up mode when the RAF carried the war to Germany basically on its own for the last time. Harris then planned to go up another gear. Since 1941, one city in particular had sat near the top of RAF Bomber Command's list of critical strikes: Hamburg. It was a second city of the Reich, a major industrial centre on the northern German coast, and it made all manner of stuff, not least U-boats and tanks and aircraft and electronics, and the Ministry of Economic Warfare considered it to be the fourth most important target in the whole of Germany. It had been attacked 100 times since hostility had started, but to no great effect. To date, there had been 10 raids in 1943, killing just 142 people and destroying just 100 buildings. This was the reality of Bomber Command's impact on Germany up to the spring of 1943. In a report from the Bombing Operations Directive of the Air Ministry, it had been noted that if a saturation incendiary attack was concentrated north of the Elbe River and focused on the tightly packed medieval architecture of Hamburg's working class districts, it would present a, quote, outstanding target to burn down. On May the 27th, Harris called his staff together and announced his intention to remove Hamburg from the map by fire. The operation's name was Gomorrah, the city in the Bible that God smote from this world for its sins. The plan was to launch a series of attacks over a 10-day period, with the RAF bombing by night and the USAAF bombing by day, starting with an RAF attack on the night of the 24th-25th of July. But to make certain of the attack, Harris planned to use the latest of his technical tricks to help the bomber stream get through. For months, the Air Ministry had been having an argument about whether or not to deploy a thing that they called window, thousands of metallic strips dumped in bundles down the flare chutes of the bombers, which, when they dispersed into the air, effectively gave radar operators tens of thousands of false return signals, blinding the German defences. Robert Lindemann, known as Lord Cherwell, had argued that it should not be used until such a time as the Allies themselves could effectively counter it. On the face of this might sound sensible, but ignored the fact that Germany was in no real position to attack the United Kingdom in strength. A secondary and perhaps more realistic concern was raised by the combined chiefs of staff, as the landings were about to happen in Sicily imminently, and possibly the Germans might copy the idea there and use it to confuse Allied radar during the landings. Both these concerns meant delays in Window's use. In point of fact, the Germans had actually realised that metal strips could disrupt radar some time ago. They had a version which they called Dupel, and for almost exactly the same reasons, Goering had forbade its use to stop the Allies from copying it. By June 1943, the technical improvements to British air intercept and ground control radar were good enough to allow Harris to argue that it was indeed time to, quote, open the window, as Churchill put it. Good joke from the old man there. And so it was, on the night of the 24th-25th July 1943, Operation Gomorrah saw 728 aircraft, a mixture of Lancasters, Stirlings and Halifaxes, grope their way to Hamburg. 80 miles from the target, Pathfinder Force Lancasters began to dump window, and all hell broke loose among the Kammhübel line and the Luftwaffe control centres. Their radar screens became a haze of returns. Ground controllers called out hundreds of different contacts spreading out over hundreds of miles of sky, and the radio waves filled with confused, scared and angry German voices. Out in the darkness, the RAF pilots could see radar-controlled searchlights careening crazily across the sky. In the words of one young pilot, it looked like they were drunk or scared, as they pointed in random directions. We didn't know what was going on. The Luftwaffe's night fighter air intercept radars were rendered useless. AA guns fired blindly in a vain attempt to put off the bombers by weight of fire alone, but unguided they had no effect. In just under an hour, the attackers dropped 2,284 tons of bombs on the western side of the city, including an average of 17,000 incendiaries per square kilometre, nearly as many incendiaries in each 1,000 metre by 1,000 metre box as the German Air Force had dropped on London during the whole of their 57-night campaign on the British capital. The aiming wasn't perfect. Half the bombs missed the 3-mile square aiming zone, but it didn't matter. Huge fires were started across the city, and the Reich Statistical Office estimated that some 10,289 civilians were killed, nearly 10 times as many has been killed in the city in the entirety of the war to that point. The fires were still burning the next day when the USAAF came on. They launched their 34th and 35th raids of the war against Germany on the subsequent 2 days. Of the 218 B-17s that hit Hamburg and Kiel on the 25th, and the 54 that hit Hamburg on the 26th, fully 37 were lost as the German Air Force responded like hornets whose nest had been disturbed. For the USAAF, it was a baptism of fire that presaged the slaughter that they would suffer over Schweinfurt just 3 weeks later. They killed nearly 500 Hamburg residents on the ground in the process, but missed the shipyards almost completely, dropping most of their load onto the smoke and flames started by the RAF. But the worst was still to come for the dissonance of Hamburg. On the night of the 27th-28th July, the RAF came back on again in a textbook attack, this time against the eastern districts. Aided by a Goldilocks zone of weather, summer temperatures of over 30 degrees at 6 o'clock in the evening, exceptionally low humidity, and gusting winds, 729 RAF bombers dropped in a tightly concentrated load, 2,326 tons in just over an hour. The bombing and the marking was near perfect. 1,200 tons of incendiaries fell in an hour on an area of less than 2 square miles and started fires on an unprecedented level. The fires grew in the wind and became one mass of flame that tore through the city. Efforts to stem the flames failed as exhausted crews found their water mains running dry and the roads had become impassable due to walls of flame. The fires began to merge into one vast, shrieking column. Underground it sucked cold air upwards out of hundreds of bomb shelters, suffocating thousands of occupants in the process. In the superheated streets, 100-mile-an-hour winds picked up trees, vehicles, homes, cats, dogs, men, women, children, tossed them into the sky and burst them into flames. This was the firestorm. Trees hundreds of yards from the flame centre caught fire as their sap ignited. Everything in its path not made of stone was incinerated. Smoke rose more than 2 miles into the air. RAF crews reported being able to smell burning flesh in their planes at 18,000 feet. On board one of those Lancasters was the commander of 8th Air Force's Bombing Command, Frederick Anderson, there to observe British marking techniques. More than 18,000 people died in the flames, a number unequalled by a single attack until a certain Curtis LeMay thought, gosh, look at all those paper houses, and launched Operation Meeting House against Tokyo almost exactly 2 years later. By morning the city was a charred mass, as panic broke out amongst the survivors trying to get out of the city. But still Harris was not done. 2 further raids killed another 10,000 on the night of the 29th, 30th of July and the 2nd, 3rd of August. In 3 nights, in one city, Bomber Command had killed more people than the Luftwaffe had killed in 9 months over London, Birmingham, Bristol, Cardiff, Coventry, Glasgow, Hull, Liverpool, Manchester, Plymouth, Portsmouth, Sheffield and Southampton combined. Fully 2% of Hamburg's population had been burnt to death. 16,000 homes were completely destroyed, and 45,000 people in all had been killed in the 3 attacks. 1.2 million people fled the city. And yet this was not the most devastating attack made by Bomber Command in 1943. That nadir was reached later on the nights of the 22nd, 23rd of October 1943 over Kassel. A mixed force of 569 Lancasters and Halifax attacked there, using H2S to blind mark the dead centre of the city and starting 3,600 major fires. Nearly 65% of all homes were destroyed, perhaps as much as 40% of the population became casualties, with 5,599 listed as dead by the authorities the next month. The town was essentially erased from the map, along with the work that it was doing on the V1 and V2 rockets. In Berlin, there was palpable shock at what had been done, and an attempt was made to suppress the news. Police, army and SS tried to stop Hamburg citizens from leaving for fear that they would sow despondency into the rest of the Reich. Goebbels, Hitler and Speer met, trying to work out what to do next. For the second time that summer, Speer came close to collapse in the face of what he thought might be the death knell of the Reich. 900,000 people had been made homeless, and 61% of residential buildings had been damaged or destroyed. 580 industrial targets were burnt down, along with 2,600 small businesses. RAF losses were incredibly light, just 2.5% of the attacking force. The head of the German night fighting force, Kammhuber, who'd been fighting a political battle with the OKL and Hitler, was sacked. Speer's right-hand man in the Organisation Tot, a man called Hans Kerl, had a nervous breakdown. Chief of the Air Staff, Hans Jesenek, who had advocated until very recently for throwing as much weight to the Eastern Front as possible, was widely blamed for the disaster. To protect himself, he wrote a long list of all of the ways that Göring had fucked up, and for reasons that surpass human understanding, he'd given it to Hitler's adjutant and not to Hitler, resulting in it getting back to Göring. A few days later, Hitler called Jesenek and ranted at him for over an hour, ending the call with the phrase, "You know what is left for you to do now." Jesenek shot himself. His temporary replacement, General Oberhurst Kotten, with the approval from Hitler and Göring, moved 1,000 fighters into the Reich, that's 45.5% of their entire strength, as well as moving a further 200 into France, essentially stripping the Eastern Front bare in the process, leaving behind less than 500 serviceable machines for the entire front. In November of 1943, Luftwaffe Jagdkorps 1, responsible for protecting northern and western Germany, was put under... Wait, hang on. Jenkins, are you sure this is right? Him? They gave him this job? Okay. So apparently under one Beppo Schmidt, a man who some of you may have been familiar with for his single-handed crippling of the Luftwaffe intelligence during the Battle of Britain, constantly assuring everybody that the Luftwaffe was winning when it wasn't, and a man closer to being a clown than a serious staff officer. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what you get in an organisation, or indeed in a country, where toadying gets you further than being competent. Nevertheless, Schmidt's command, if not Schmidt himself, was impressive, certainly in terms of numbers, having in January 1943 being composed of just a single fighter wing. By December it was 11 wings and 20 Kruppe. This shift permanently ceded air superiority on the Eastern Front to the Soviets, both locally and strategically, and that in turn allowed them to conduct their own version of Blitzkrieg, and inspired thousands of slightly annoying teenagers to play Il Tu Sturmovich years later. Well, alright, that last bit we can't totally blame Bomber Command for, but you get the idea. As the air attacks of 1943 turned into the fire and fury of Big Week in 1944, Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, a properly Nazi-looking motherfucker if ever there was one, took command of the overall air defences of the Reich, and by February 44 commanded not just the fighters, but also all the anti-aircraft batteries, the searchlights and so on too, finally creating a system that was somewhere close to what Dowding had had back in 1940. In the economy, the attacks of the summer of 1943 forced Speer and Hitler to start to shift the whole of the German economy away from the offensive and towards the defensive. For example, by the end of the Battle of Ruhr, something like 250,000 labourers were involved in producing equipment solely for the anti-aircraft effort. Flat gun barrel production increased by about 30% in the first half of 1943, and over the full year, Germany would produce 4,416 88mm, 1,220 105mm, 282 128mm flat guns. And light flak production, as we've talked about before in other videos, was unbelievable. There were 31,000 20mm and nearly 5,000 37mm guns, most of which should have gone to the east to shore up their defences, or maybe even have gone to the Med, but instead stayed in the Reich, pointed at the sky. The guns were now manned by 790,000 uniformed Luftwaffe troops, augmented by 528,000 Hitler Youth, BDM girls, POWs, slaves and forced labourers. Following the Dams raid, which fell right in the middle of the battle, Speer was forced to order Atlantic Wall production to stop entirely for 5 months to make good the damage, and he shipped thousands of forced labourers and slave labourers to make the repairs good. Thus, when the British and American troops stormed the beaches on D-Day in June, they were a fraction of the defences there that had been expected. For the Axis, the air assault on the Ruhr and on Hamburg capped a disastrous year on every front. The surrender of 6th Army at Stalingrad had put Hitler on his back foot and forced him to place all of his bets on Citadel, but that was turning into a rout by the time that Hamburg was being hit. The Soviets threw 2 huge counter-thrusts in Operation Kuznetsov in July and Operation Rumstanzev in August, which basically kicked the Wehrmacht's shit in. And as if that wasn't enough, the RAF strikes on Italy were having a huge impact too, in a rare example of strategic bombing doing what Trenchard et al. Had predicted and causing a government to fall. On the 19th of July, a combined force of the USAF and RAF bombs went and bombed Rome during daytime in a serious way for the first time, and the impact was incredible. The lack of Italian preparations for serious air raids saw 1,500 people killed, and the disastrous losses for the Italian armed forces on basically every front, as well as the economic collapse of the country, all came together with the weight of the bombs and tipped the Italian government over the edge. At a meeting of the fascist Grand Council on the 24th of July, Mussolini was deposed, and it was the beginning of the end for Germany's principal ally. And yet, despite calamity on every front, and the catastrophe of the Battle of the Ruhr, and the razing of Hamburg, the Nazi will to resist did not break. A sober and clear assessment of the British, and to some extent the American bombing campaign, should probably have realised that if the Nazi regime was not broken now, then no amount of area bombing, or come to that, precision bombing, could, on its own anyway, bring about the end of the war. And yet both Hap Arnold for the Americans and Butcher Harris for the British took a diametrically opposed view. For Acre and the 8th, this meant going off and attacking Schweinfurt. For the British, it meant something even worse. Harris was beginning to conclude that he was on the cusp of destroying his enemy, and he started to look covetously at what he could do to Berlin. And then, in his eyes at least, he was forced to change direction and go somewhere completely different, specifically to a place called Peenemünde. The raid, which perhaps showed an alternative path that Bomber Command might have walked down under different leadership, took place on the 18th of August 1943. Since before the war, Peenemünde had been a place where weird and wonderful Wunderwaffen were tested and developed, not least the Feisler Fi-103 pulse jet, which would become known as the V1, the A4 rocket, which would become known as the V2, the testing area for the Me-262 and 163. It was basically the Army's principal research station, home to hundreds of Germany's leading scientists, including Werner von Braun. By the end of 1943, a hazy but compelling picture of the site was in the hands of the British. Something very, very nasty was being developed there, possibly with the ability to deliver biological or potentially even nuclear payloads onto London. Reports spoke of 10-ton bombs capable of killing 100,000 Londoners in a month and flattening the entire city in 6. It had to be destroyed. Consequently, 560 aircraft were assigned to something called Operation Hydra, a plan to destroy the plant by dropping 1,800 tons of bombs onto key buildings across the site. It would be led by a master bomber from the Pathfinders, a chap called John Searby of 83 Squadron, and his job would be to oversee the marking of targets in a sequence that was worked out at 8 Group HQ, shifting the attack across the site, marking the points in a pre-arranged pattern over about 40 minutes to ensure that each component of the research facility was given due care and attention. The crews involved were told not much more than it was a radar station which, if they did not destroy it on the first attempt, they would have to keep going back to until it was wiped out. German air defence and night fighter activity was expected to be highly intense. The plan here was to try and spoof that and to break it up a bit. 139 Squadron would fly towards Berlin, and the 3 actual attacking waves would fly 100 miles south of the target to look like they were following them in, and then do a dogleg at the last minute, turning north and running to the rocket factory, dumping window madly to try and distract the night fighters. The German response to the initial phase of the attack was to put up 150 planes to defend Berlin, aiming to trap the bomber stream between them and the 89 heavy flak batteries below, but slowly it began to dawn on them that the Tommies weren't coming, and then they saw the telltale Christmas tree lights falling far to the north. Some stayed obediently waiting for orders, but most peeled off and charged north, arriving just as the third wave of Lancasters from 5 Group struck. In a frantic few minutes, they engaged and shot down 40 British bombers, killing 288 aircrew in the process for loss of 12 of their own. But the damage had been done. Although the telemetry buildings and the wind tunnel survived, all other major buildings were destroyed and dozens of programs were disrupted. It forced Speer to disperse the efforts on the rocket and pulse jet program across Germany and to start building huge underground production sites for the Me-262 and V2, which set back both programs months. Above all, it proved that Bomber Command could hit precision targets, but Harris ignored this and raged about the diversion of resources and the cost of the attack. The Battle of the Ruhr had convinced Harris that he could end the war alone, and he could do it now, when in fact it probably should have convinced him that a land invasion was essential. He would brook no more delays, and he set his eyes on what he felt was the main course, Berlin. The pattern of raids on the German capital, that is, in hindsight, called the Battle of Berlin, is generally dated to have started in November of 1943, but in reality, Harris started sending regular raids to Berlin much earlier than that, starting on the 23rd of August, and repeating on and off through September and October. Losses were immediately far too high, running at nearly 8%. That's twice the magic number of 4% necessary for crews to have any chance of surviving a tour of operations. These attacks are often positioned as Harris's decision alone, but actually that's far from the case. Churchill, Portal and many others had basically backed away from responsibility for what happened next after the fact, like campers who found a bear sleeping in their tent all night, but in reality all of them had been egging Harris on for years by this point. As early as June 1942, more than 12 months before the raid, Churchill was writing intemperate memos to Portal and to Harris, demanding that they attack Berlin as soon as possible, and Harris had quite sensibly resisted, knowing that his force wasn't ready. But in August 43, with the Ruhr in ruins, or so he thought, he felt he might finally be able to address the task. The slightly random nature of Harris's targeting is evident because despite having gone there 8 times by November and being well aware of the difficulties the United States Army Air Force was having, it wasn't until November that Harris actually wrote to Churchill to seek his support for an attack on Berlin. Harris's subsequent memo has gone down in legend as one of the most ill-cited documents ever written. In it he said he felt certain that Germany must collapse before this programme. We must get the United States Army Air Forces to wade in greater force. We can wreck Berlin from end to end if the United States will come in on it. The cost to us will be 400 to 500 aircraft. The cost to Germany will be the war. The US AF, as those who've watched previous episodes of this series will know, was currently spitting out blood and teeth following a pair of disastrous raids on Schweinfurt that had knocked the stuffing out of their ability to strike, if not their willingness. Harris was lost in his own hubris and went again anyway. This was bonkers on several levels. Firstly, the weather in winter was shocking, with massive headwinds, icing and cloud cover that reduced Bomber Command's effectiveness almost to the point of stupidity. Secondly, he was loading his Lancasters up. The loads were shifted from about £9,000 to over £10,500, which was the screaming limit of what they could carry at that range, and it cost them height, making them very vulnerable to ground fire. Thirdly, Berlin was fucking massive. It was 883 square miles, and comparatively spread out, making it impossible, no matter how many incendiaries were dropped, to burn the way that he'd managed to burn Hamburg. Fourthly, Oboe couldn't reach this far into Germany, and Berlin did not present a good picture on H2S. Lastly, and most critically, shifting away from the Ruhr, where 80% of German industry operated, gave the Luftwaffe and the German economy some breathing space. And Harris must have known this, because even the Mew, who normally gave him such good, if wildly over-optimistic news, said so. And RE8, the pessimist he kept in the cupboard to remind him that it was human, also said so. And the Americans said so. And the British Chiefs of Staff said so. There was no excuse for changing course other than his own massive fucking ego. During the Battle of Berlin, Harris's force launched 9,111 sorties against Berlin in 16 major attacks, and 11,113 sorties against other cities at the same time. They lost a barely conceivable 1,047 aircraft in the process, as German defences hardened, about 5.1% of all aircraft sent, meaning that crews on a 35-mission tour were absolutely guaranteed to die before the end of their first tour. In fact, actually, it was slightly worse than the bald statistics suggest, because when you drill down into it, you realise that of the sorties that were flown, fully 2,000 were flown by Mosquitoes, and they only lost 20 aircraft, meaning that the preponderance of losses hit the bomber fleet, most especially the Stirlings and the Halifaxes, who were rapidly withdrawn from raids on Germany, leaving the Lancasters to take the brunt of the killing. Defended by swarms of night fighters, surrounded by the heaviest anti-aircraft defences in the world, and with massive banks of searchlights, Berlin was an incredibly hard target. The crews hit little and they died in their droves. Cloud cover meant blind bombing on sky markers was the best that they could do, and inevitably these drifted in the wind. Recon follow-up was virtually impossible in the winter weather. Of 37 photo recon sorties launched during the battle, just 2 got clear shots of the city, so Harris had literally no idea what he was achieving for the hideous losses that he was suffering. And that didn't stop the Mew from claiming that they'd dehoused between 320,000 and 800,000 civilians, a staggeringly broad number, indicative of how little they actually knew about what they were doing. And they pointed out to anyone that cared to listen that in 1943, Bomber Command had dropped over 130,000 tons of bombs, compared to just 16,000 by the Army Air Forces. But it didn't cut any political ice with their masters, who just saw the loss rates and noticed that Germany wasn't slowing down, and that the clock was ticking down towards D-Day. As Bomber Command's losses mounted, the stream of press releases, propaganda films and backroom briefings parted company with reality completely. That Harris was away with the fairies was not lost on the new commanders of 8th Air Force, Jimmy Doolittle, or his boss Carl Spaatz, or indeed actually on the head of the RAF, Charles Portal, who was technically Supreme Allied Air Commander, or indeed on Bert's own staff. A quiet rebellion started, led by Bottomley and Bufton, who had not forgotten their ritual humiliation of the previous year over the Pathfinders. Bottomley wrote a letter to Portal saying that either Harris had to change his policy and accept commands from the Supreme Allied Command, or Supreme Allied Command needed to change their whole planning for Overlord. This, of course, was no choice at all. Berlin clearly wasn't collapsing. 8th Air Force losses were climbing, not falling. The number of German fighters that was being produced was clearly going up, not down. The evidence of failure was written in the blood of the young crews in British and American uniform. Harris, as late as December 1943, was still behaving as if the landings were somehow optional, when the entirety of the Allied economic and military might was geared towards a ground invasion of France in June of 1944. Harris later claimed that as soon as the die was cast, he got behind Overlord, but this was frankly bollocks. Overlord had been a commitment since July 1943, and everybody knew it. He continued not just the Battle of Berlin, but other deeper raids further into the Reich to hit other cities too. Harris's political capital, never strong due to his uncharming personality and his stubbornness, began to evaporate, and then in one night it went permanently. On the night of the 30th to the 31st of March 1944, Harris sent bombers to the city of Nuremberg, the holy city of the Nazi Party. The route was straight in and straight out on a night with a full moon. No diversion, no doglegs, and nowhere to hide. Don Bennett was horrified. He called Harris's Chief of Staff, Air Marshal Sawnby, who got the group commanders on a secure scrambler call. 4 of the 6 supported the route, as it meant the shortest possible time over enemy territory. Bennett thought it meant that the night fighters would know precisely where they were headed from almost the moment they crossed the coast. Harris went with the majority. In a near cloudless sky, on a moonlit night so bright that it was like day, the raid was cut apart by marauding night fighters. Of 795 bombers that were dispatched, 95 were shot down, 543 aircrew were killed, more than had been killed in the entirety of the Battle of Britain, and the total loss rate, including the aircraft that got back and had to be written off, was 12%, 3 times the acceptable loss rate. It was a profound shock to Harris and his staff. Portal, by now Supreme Allied Commander of the Air Forces, should have fired Harris but didn't. Instead, he gave the problem to Arthur Tedder to sort out. And that's a whole other story which I've covered before, but to suffice to say here that it marked the end of Harris's ability to act independently. For the rest of the war, he had to apply to others for his targets, and his political capital, always low, was spent. There were many consequences for Bomber Command, and indeed for Bert Harris, which we will explore when we turn our attention finally to 1944 and 45 and the end game. It's been put to me that I do not believe that strategic bombing was worth it, or that I feel that this was all a waste. That is not the case. It demonstrably worked, but only in conjunction with other arms of warfare, what Churchill called trifibious warfare, war on land, on sea and in the air. As frustrating as it has been to chart both the USAAF's and the RAF's utter failure to adapt to the realities of war, and to lean into the possibilities, as we go forward they did achieve remarkable things in the end, and probably only achieve it when they had this weight and the experiences that they'd had, and of course the kit that they would get in 1944 and 45, when they would drop in just 8 months 75% of the entire bomb load dropped during the war. Well, my little street urchins, it's been so lovely to talk to you today, and hopefully Jenkins will be through in a moment just to remove the hypnotism that's been put on some of you to make sure that you stay to the end. You should be absolutely fine afterwards, just maybe avoid the Malaysian Prime Minister for a little bit. I just wanted to say thank you very, very much for getting through what has been an enormously long video. When I first started to sit down and try and write this series, it was 1943 that gave me the heebie-jeebies. It often gets missed and skipped when we're talking about the bombing war. Kind of the narrative goes, the British started to bomb, they missed everything, the Americans turned up and bombed in daylight, they had a Schweinfurt, suddenly it's the end of the war. And there's not like a lot of detail or flesh put on the bone, so hopefully I've given you some understanding of what the RAF was doing in 1943, when really it was still carrying the attack to Germany pretty much for the last time in the war, but almost on its own because of what it could do. And what happens in 44 and 45, which we'll come back and look at, and we'll really consider how the war was brought to an end, will hopefully give you a bit more again around like what it meant and how the United States looked at the lessons that the RAF was teaching and actually employed the ones that worked and changed its doctrine. And really it's the USAAF changing its doctrine and increasing the numbers of bombers out there that genuinely brought the whole thing to a close. We'll see that next time out. I would be remiss if I didn't say an enormous thank you to my patrons, because this has taken me about 4 months to write, just this episode on its own. It's really not been simple, and they have been enormously patient with me, so a huge thank you to them. And if you'd like to join them, do feel free to do so. You get access to my Discord, you get to see videos that I produce a little bit earlier than everybody else, and if you'd like to try and support me in a different way, then feel free to have a look at the merch store. I've got some bits and pieces down there. By the way, I'm always open to suggestion. If there are things that you particularly want me to see me do, designs you want me to put out, then I'm happy to do that too. So in the meantime, a heartfelt thank you to all of you. Grovelling and excuses done. Jenkins will now escort you to the village tub where you can wash and freshen up for your journey home. I do not recommend resistance.